Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for CMAP Talks, Effective Virtual Public Meetings. My name is Jake Sy, and I'm a senior planner with CMAP. We are really excited to have you with us today to talk about a subject that's on every planner's mind these days, public meetings. The goal of today's presentation is to understand the challenges for public meetings caused by the COVID-19 crisis and how we can use online platforms and tools to reach our audiences and effectively engage in the community. We have an incredible panel with us today who are successfully navigating the new world of public engagement. The live cameras will be off today, just static images and slides. I can assure you that the picture that you're seeing are still accurate. It's not like any of us have been affected by the stress and anxiety of the last couple months or anything like that. So today we're going to talk about best practices for public meetings and plan commission hearings, and also talk about how communities are addressing public meetings for new planning projects, things like comprehensive plans and neighborhood plans and those kinds of things. As planners and people that care about cities, we have a major opportunity here to rethink the way we engage the public as the world continues to change in the weeks and months to come. The thought that we keep coming back to is how we can provide residents with ways to engage with community leadership, whether it's in person, online, by phone, Pony Express, because it's probably, well, hopefully, going to be all of those things for the foreseeable future. I should note that the guidance that we're providing today is really a snapshot of the current environment. As you all know, this is a pretty fluid situation, so we'll have to keep learning and adapting, like we always do, as things continue to change. Before we dive in, just had a few housekeeping items. All right, so you're going to be all in listen-only mode. I just lost the webinar. Hold on a sec. There's a chat function on your screen to access the chat box, but we're going to be relying on that questions box and monitoring that throughout the presentation. Our three panelists are going to provide their presentations, and then we'll be handling all or as many of those questions as possible at the end. A recording of this presentation will be available after the webinar, and we'll also be sending up a follow-up survey after this, so please respond to that when you have a chance. Okay, so our panel today, we've got a fantastic group of speakers. First is Rory Fancler-Splitt. She's a planner from Kimley-Horn. She'll be talking about using various online platforms to meet your needs. Kimley-Horn has a national practice, so she'll also give us a peek at what's happening in communities across the country for project-based planning meetings. Next, Andy Cross, senior planner from the City of Highland Park. He will give us the municipal planner's perspective and experience on public hearings. Andy and the staff in Highland Park have done an incredible amount of work to get this process right and provide a template that other communities can learn from. Last is Greg Jones, partner at Ancel Glink. He's going to cover the basis from a legal perspective. Greg will provide 10 guidelines that you should follow for every public meeting, and he'll have a focus on some of the due process issues that are at play as well. So that's it for me. First up, here's Rory Fancler-Splitt from Kimley-Horn. Take it away, Rory.
Thanks, Jake. So for many municipalities, public hearings have continued as essential business under the stay-at-home order. As Jake mentioned, Andy will specifically address virtual public hearings and his experience in Highland Park. But as we move forward with reopening the state and consider continuing or initiating planning projects, whether it's a comprehensive plan, downtown plan, corridor study, or other initiatives, a new phase of COVID-19 impacts emerges for planners. Similar to public hearings, public meetings in general, including open houses, are transitioning to virtual platforms in order to avoid large gatherings. With this shift comes some benefits and challenges. A key benefit, though, can be engaging a broader constituency, but this requires upfront coordination and communication. Next slide, Jane. Through experiences across the country, we have, as Jake mentioned, planners working under various phases of reopening. And through their collective experiences, we're learning the importance of upfront coordination and essentially kind of a planning 101 concept. What is the purpose of your meeting and the importance of determining that before you define the virtual tool you should be using. Just because your organization has an existing GoToMeeting account does not mean that it's necessarily the appropriate tool. So kind of going back to planning school, what is the public involvement objective? Is it to inform, where you're simply communicating information to your constituency? Consult, where you're soliciting feedback or input? Or collaborate, where it's a partnership, kind of going back and forth to develop a solution or evaluate alternatives. Depending on what you are trying to achieve, there's a myriad of virtual meeting tools available. I will also say that your participation levels may dictate the tool you should be using. For example, Skype and GoToMeeting have participant limitations of 250. We recently had a public open house for transportation master plan outside of Atlanta, which has been opened, as we know. As a part of that meeting, we had asked participants to register in advance. In that case, more than 200 people registered. And so despite some favorable capabilities, WebEx was not an option because it does have a participant limit of 200 people. The meeting was subsequently hosted using Zoom, which has a maximum participation level of 1,000 if you're using Zoom Webinar or Zoom Large Meeting format. And then we used polling via Mentimeter and MetroQuest. Next slide. So Kimley-Horn has produced a quick brochure that will be available on the CMAP website that lists all of the various virtual meeting tools, whether it's Skype, Facebook Live, YouTube, GoToMeeting, Zoom, WebEx, and others. This matrix outlines optimal use of the tool, whether it's to inform, consult, and/or collaborate. Included in the matrix is a general scale of price, lead time to launch your meeting, effort to create and maintain, and participant limitations. Integrated features such as polling, forums, interactive activities, and Section 508 accessibility compliance are also listed. This same information is provided for the various survey and feedback tools such as Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, MetroQuest, Bing the Table, and others. Again, the matrix will be made available on the CMAP website, and it's intended to provide a starting point for your organization as you move forward with virtual public meetings. Depending on the purpose of your meeting and stakeholders involved, you may want to use more than one tool. Okay, so as Jake mentioned, based on collective experiences across the country, we've come up with this working list of best practices, and I'll emphasize working list. Things are constantly changing, and with each virtual public meeting, we're walking away with some lessons learned. So I anticipate this list will change and grow over time. And I can say that probably we'll be having more of these conversations locally as we each host virtual public meetings beyond just a public hearing. So based on experiences in Texas, Georgia, Ohio, and Minneapolis over the past 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, we've developed this list for discussion today. Timeline impacts. Digital public involvement can have significant impacts on your project timeline. The duration of digital public involvement will likely extend longer than was originally planned for in-person involvement to allow for adequate participation levels. Another note on timing, looking ahead as you're scoping new projects in your organization, there is a likelihood, no one has a crystal ball, but it's very likely that meetings in the future will need to include both in-person and digital or virtual public engagement options in order to provide accessibility to all constituents. There are obviously staff and project timeline impacts of providing public engagement opportunities in multiple formats, and that needs to be considered as you move forward with your project or initiative. Communicate the meeting format. If this is an ongoing planning project and you are pivoting to a virtual environment, be sure to communicate this change and specifically how the input that you will be gathering virtually relates to input solicited through previous in-person efforts. A couple of specific tips that we've developed over the course of the past couple of weeks related to communication: send out a how-to PDF or post it to your project website so members of the public who maybe haven't used the medium, maybe they aren't familiar with Zoom or WebEx or GoToMeetings, make sure that there's a quick cheat sheet for them available on your website or distributed via email so that they can have everything ready and tested before they join. Another tip is to record your virtual event. Most of these virtual tools include a recording function that will allow you to post the event to your project website and solicit input for those who may not have participated live. Messaging. Simplify your messaging for digital involvement. The public is used to quick, easily digestible content on digital platforms. Think of Twitter, and will likely not engage with something incredibly complex. Keep in mind, digital content can be easily shared out of context or misconstrued, so the need for a simple, clear, and concise message is important. Simple messaging is less likely to gain legs of its own and morph in a digital space. Be sensitive. We all know that this is a scary, anxiety-inducing time for many. When involving the public, ensure that you are being sensitive to higher priority concerns and time constraints. One possible attempt to make digital public involvement opportunities lighthearted and fun, but be respectful of possible individual responses and reactions. Consider your constituency, which may have limited access to the internet and digital opportunities, and consider opportunities to specifically engage with underrepresented populations. This may not be an option locally in the immediate term, but as we look ahead, start to think about creative solutions, whether it's putting together a meeting in a box that could be dropped off at a community center, library, senior living center, food bank. Prepare materials for printing, paper distribution of online surveys and other feedback opportunities. A side note, be prepared for increased involvement. People are very comfortable online. Some people, not all, not myself, but some people have more time right now to dedicate to local issues. I can say based on meetings in other states that have occurred already, we have had higher participation levels universally for each meeting, higher participation levels than we would have seen pre-COVID-19. Also consider digital accessibility. If federal funding is being used, Section 508 compliance required. Not all virtual tools offer this capability. Zoom and WebEx do. That will be included or is included in the matrix that will be on CMAP's website. Engage representative voices. In some cases, the value that can be gained from meeting in person can be lost in a digital format. I think we all have stories of connections that we've made and relationships that have been developed through planning processes. In effort to not lose that, work with your steering committee, elected and appointed officials, or community groups to identify key representatives and project champions that can help facilitate digital public engagement. These individuals and groups can also help distribute event notifications through existing virtual networks, whether it's Facebook or school district listservs. There are existing virtual networks that can be tapped into to spread the word of your meeting. A minor gesture, but this was very impactful to relationship building for a recent virtual public meeting for a corridor plan for the city of Columbus, Ohio. It was a steering committee, so it was a smaller group, but we had everyone state their name before they spoke. Again, super minor, but allowed for participants to realize individual and organization perspectives. And it's also a best practice for participants with visual and hearing impairments, particularly important in a digital environment. And finally, last but not least, and I think Andy will touch upon this for public hearings as well, but do a practice run. Make sure you've planned allotted time to do a practice run and walk through every detail of logistics. Have a backup plan. A reminder to staff your virtual meeting differently. You'll need a moderator, someone to facilitate the digital tool, and if available, someone from IT to address technical issues. A couple of other related tips: consider allowing participants to join, 5, 10, 15 minutes prior to the actual start of your meeting to allow time to handle any technical issues. Otherwise, that time bleeds into your meeting and all of a sudden your hour meeting is now 45 minutes. Provide a call-in number for all virtual meetings for those without access to the internet or with connection limitations, which may preclude use of video. Also, if possible, provide meeting materials online or via email for those who may experience technical difficulties so that they can follow along and have a meaningful meeting experience. Be sure to number any materials that you're distributing in advance and use that numbering as you walk through your slides or materials. And finally, if you are using a multitude of virtual meeting tools, for example, polling, consider front loading or back loading different tools so that you're not moving between interfaces, and that's recommended in order to minimize technical issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy, who will specifically address public hearings.
Thank you, Rory. As Rory mentioned, I'm Andy Cross. I'm a senior planner with the City of Highland Park. And that is a community on the North Shore of Chicago on Lake Michigan, for those of you who might not be familiar. And I've been there for about 11 years. And for 10.75 of those years, we had a really good grip on public hearings. Really good process going at City Hall and in the council chambers. But with the health crisis, we had to kind of reconsider how we were going to approach it. So we're staffed with coming up with a new standard operating procedure on running virtual meetings. And so what I'd like to share with you is a busy city planner's perspective on how to run public hearings online. And what makes a public hearing different than a lot of public engagement meetings or even more formalized meetings is that in a public hearing setting, it's very important to have meaningful presentations. Applicants, as you all know in the planning community, need to feel like they're putting their best foot forward, like they had a fair shake. So meaningful presentations and the opportunity to give them are important. There needs to be effective public input and testimony. So the public, that's what makes a public hearing, the legal entity is that the public has an opportunity to participate meaningfully and effectively. And lastly, control over the meeting. We've all been in meetings where control probably could have been better and they're just not effective. So what I'm going to do is go through our approach that we use in Highland Park that I really think is effective in checking these boxes. So let's start, and then I'm sure we'll have a time for questions later, or you can certainly use the text box there. For technology, Highland Park went with Zoom's webinar feature. As Rory mentioned, there are others out there, but this is the one we use. It's a small subscription upgrade from the free account that we all have by now. And it allows participants to be broken into these main three categories of hosts, panelists, and attendees. I'm the host of the meeting, and we'll have a co-host, as we'll touch on here. Panelists are those that can share a screen and interact, and attendees are those pretty much what you're doing now in GoTo's webinar feature, where the host has just a lot of control, and that's on that second bullet point: maximum control over the attendees. There were, and probably continue to be to some extent, safety concerns about these online meetings. And so this webinar feature with its control over attendees does ameliorate or address some of those. The public has a lot of ways to interact, and we'll touch on those soon. So we disable the chat and the polls. and the Q&A. Could you imagine a public hearing, or you've probably had some, where the audience just would not stop talking? It doesn't work, and it doesn't work virtually either. So we disabled any of that, and that's not how we solicit input from the public. The attendee list, as I mentioned, is a powerful tool. We have it set just like this webinar here today, where as an attendee, you're muted until the host does otherwise. And then you can promote people off that. So the attendee list is under constant monitoring as a host of a public hearing when you're looking at that. Let's touch on the meeting structure here. As I mentioned, all attendees to the meeting are muted when they join. But that means all commissioners and applicants, everybody is on there and they're muted. So you have to be really careful and watch the attendee list, because commissioners will come and you're wondering, oh my gosh, we don't have quorum. Well, they could just be dwelling there in the attendee list unless you're Johnny on the spot and you stay there to promote them. There's at least one co-host. That is helpful. The graphic you see on the right there is from a public hearing we had in Highland Park about 2 weeks ago. That's yours truly in the upper left-hand corner as host, and then the Director of Community Development is there next to me in the suit and tie as co-host. I was presenting on a big PUD project going on in downtown Highland Park, answering questions about zoning code interpretations and what have you, doing our job. And so then it's very tough to monitor the attendee list and curate the meeting. So that's where having a co-host is helpful. I also recommend having a script for both the chairman and the staff. Both of these are read at the beginning of the meeting. The chairman's script kind of talks about the legal foundations, Governor Pritzker's orders, the authority to hold a virtual meeting, in light of the Open Meetings Act, and then it also goes through the basics of the meeting, that all the votes are going to be roll call votes. And it's also notes to the commissioners. They don't have a chance to sort of chat before the meeting like they did for the past 10 years. And so it's to the commissioners, hey, this needs to be very orderly. You want to give testimony, let me know, and then we'll do that, or give discussion and deliberation, let me know. And this worked really pretty well for the most part, with a few bumps. Rory touched on a practice session. I did offer to meet with all of the plan commissioners online in a one-on-one. One actually did take me up on it to make sure, but we do start meetings. We were starting them an hour early, but I think now that everybody's kind of getting the hang of it, maybe just a half hour early, just that everybody can get in the room, get comfortable. The applicants, we'll touch on there. They also need to, be fluent in it. So, but a script for staff. Let me touch on this this last bullet point there. This is a chance for the city planner to, usually you make these comments at the beginning of the meeting, but it's letting everybody in attendance know that you will have an opportunity to speak. Rory mentioned this, it's sort of the fear factor. People aren't used to this. It's a brave new world. So comments that I addressed at the beginning of the meeting are less, less technical than what the chairman's doing, more procedural. Hey, if everybody's here, you're going to get a chance to speak, and pretty much also bear with us. This is new to everyone. So let's talk about how the applicants can work through this process. As I mentioned, the applicants all join as attendees, and there may be 6 or 7 of them. So they don't all need to be panelists. So I ask them, please decide who from your team you'd like to actually make presentations. And so those will be the 2 or 3, I would say probably at most, people that will promote to actually have their screens in the Hollywood Share video screen with everybody's faces. But then one of the applicants will share their screen, and not just monitor, not just camera, but share their actual screen and walk the commission through a PowerPoint, just like they would do at a regular hearing. So they don't feel like they're missing out at all. They have a chance to have their experts have virtual FaceTime with the petitioner, with the commission, and then also walk through their project like this. So this slide, you'll see this graphic on my slide, is the applicant or the applicant's architect, and he's walking through a sign feature that they're proposing on a building in Highland Park. So there were questions about it, and he was able to just walk through it in detail and answer all the questions just like a regular public hearing. Look at that 4th bullet point in italics. Make sure your applicants know what's going on. There's a sure way to slow down a meeting. That's to have that one person who always forgets they're on mute. And so, it's also good to have, the really technically savvy person share their screen, because they'll be able to rock through it and kind of go through it at a proper pace. Look at that second to last bullet point. Architects love to talk about their projects. And so they will often leave a slide or two up there and then just let it sit. So as host, it can be really helpful to be able to stop screen sharing and get everybody back full screen again. Because it's maddening to just sit there, as a participant in a meeting and stare at one slide for 10 minutes. And so when applicants are done, they're moved back to attendee status. Let me touch on one more thing here. The applicant team can have a lot of people on it. You can leave people in the attendee list, that's fine, but just allow them to talk. So they're their traffic expert or maybe some other legal counsel. They don't need to be share screening, but they need to be able to answer questions in real time. So they can be unmuted and just sort of chime in as needed. This is my last slide about public testimony here. Let me touch on this. We established in Highland Park a main landing page for all things virtual meetings, all things virtual. And it is prominently linked right on www.cityhpil.com. Right on there on the front page, there's a link to this virtual meetings webpage. And that's what creating this one landing page has done is it simplifies things for the public. They just need to go in one place to find out about historic preservation, housing commission, plan commission, zoning board of appeals, everything, city council, everything's on this page. It is also awesome as a working city planner. It really simplifies public notification. It's just not going to work to put a Zoom meeting link in certified letters and mail them out to 85, 100, 200 people. Because if anything goes wrong and you need to change that meeting, now your notice is potentially infirm. How are you going to get that updated information out there? So all of our public notices for public hearings say, please, they have a normal preamble about how this will be a virtual meeting and won't be at City Hall. But it says, please go to this website for more information, or of course, call city staff and we'll walk you through it. So having a main landing page is I think, has been really helpful. Similarly, we have a main email account, just a general planning email account. Send us an email, and we have a sort of a template that we ask you to use. If you visit the virtual meetings webpage, you'll see it, a template so that we know what item you're talking about. We also have a dedicated phone number for voicemails. It was an empty cubicle and just sort of a dead extension, and we made that the go-to voicemail message for all things Plan Commission. Because of course we have a main office number, but we didn't want that to just get absolutely bogged down if there's 150 voicemails about some contested thing. But then lastly, look here at the third sub-bullet there, meeting participation details. On our virtual meeting webpage, at this point for Plan Commission, what we've been doing is putting down the meeting ID, it's that 9 or 12-digit meeting ID, and the call-in number. And we have a paragraph, or we have information there that says, if you would like the Zoom meeting link sent to you, email us, email city staff, and we'll send it to you. So we check that planning email account a lot. And this was a nod to security. And it also lets you know if there's going to be 75 members of the public who want to log into your meeting. Now that the security thing has really not been an issue at all in Highland Park, and it hasn't. So we may end up starting to put the Zoom meeting link on the webpage just to make it easier for the public. That last bullet point there talks about how the public is instructed by staff to participate in the meeting. If you use the call-in number and dialed in the meeting ID and you're listening, dial *9 on your phone to raise your hand. And so really what I say is, all right, Mr. Chair, now is the time for public comment. I'll take public comment from those attending by phone first. If you're attending by phone and would like to make a comment to the commission, please raise your hand by dialing *9. And it works, believe me, we field tested this. We did 2 practice hearings just with city staffers. And I gave them all a little script to read and things like that. So somebody called in from their cell phone and did that, and it worked perfectly. And then, Mr. Chair, that concludes phone testimony. And so I'll now look to attendees attending in Zoom. For those of you who would like to address the commission, please raise your hand now in Zoom, and I will unmute you in order and give you a chance to address the commission. And note that we time testimony depending on the hearing, and the nature of it. We can and will time testimony to 3 or 4 minutes, and so that's very much in effect here. And so we let people know that that's still the case. So those conclude my my formal comments, and would I be happy to? So I'll cede the floor here to our third speaker, and let's hear what Greg has to say.
Thanks, Andy. Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Jones. I'm a partner with the law firm of Ancel Glink. We represent several dozen municipalities in Illinois and elsewhere. In a previous life, I worked as a planner for several communities in the Chicagoland area. So I've spent more time thinking about public hearings than I'll ever admit, and particularly wrestling with how to handle remote public hearings over the course of the last couple of months, like many of you, I suspect. So to help shorten the learning curve, we've prepared a set of best practices for communities that are looking to hold remote hearings during the governor's stay-at-home and other executive orders. We'll walk through those today, and the best practices will be also available on CMAP's website and are available on Ancel Glink's website too. So like any guidelines, these guidelines necessarily will require some customization depending on the community, their constituents, and their technological capacity, but they are good general rules of thumb to follow, and we're excited to talk about them today with all of you. So our first guideline is to hold only necessary hearings. Both the governor and the attorney general have encouraged municipalities to postpone meetings when possible. And this was admittedly an easier proposition when the stay-at-home order was only expected to last for a few weeks. Here we are multiple months later, and it gets more and more difficult for communities to just stop doing everything as the orders continue on. As a side note, we expect the governor will issue yet another round of executive orders either today or tomorrow, extending the stay-at-home status likely through the remainder of June. So for anyone who was hoping this would go away soon, sorry. When determining whether or not to hold a zoning hearing, and these guidelines primarily relate to zoning hearings, I should be clear about that. It's important to recognize that municipalities have a statutory obligation to conduct public hearings on zoning applications. They are the Plan Commission or the Zoning Board of Appeals are the legally designated hearing body under state law. Legalities aside, there are real economic development concerns associated with just stopping all applications moving forward. So there's legal concerns and practical concerns. Communities that are holding remote zoning hearings or starting to think about it are necessarily engaging in a prioritization process. So they're trying to determine what applications should move forward and which ones can maybe wait. The answer is commonly different for each community. Larger, more economically significant projects sometimes present a clear, logical connection to essential government business that should potentially move forward. But these proposals can also be more controversial, and remote zoning hearings that have a lot of controversy are frequently challenging to administer, as I'm sure Andy can speak to at length. In contrast, smaller, less controversial applications like residential fence variance or a setback reduction for a small addition can likely be handled easily on a remote platform, but are these really essential to move forward now during a pandemic? Is this really essential government business? One court that weighed in on the issue of what constitutes a necessary meeting, and this is an Illinois court, it declined to question a city's decision to move forward on a specific application, and instead said that it was up to each community to decide what meetings are necessary. This is a particularly helpful decision taken by at least one court, but it doesn't mean that every court will decide the same way. So the big takeaway here on this first point is that communities need to think about and possibly come up with an analytical framework for what hearings should move forward. Communities should also consider shifting some of the risk onto the zoning applicants by having them sign a hold harmless agreement, waiving claims against the municipality regarding the remote hearing process, and agreeing to defend the municipality if there is a challenge. Taking these steps will help mitigate risk associated with remote hearings and allow important public business to move forward. So our second guideline is to adopt emergency rules. Many, if not all of you, know that the governor signed an executive order in mid-March that suspended certain provisions of the Open Meetings Act. He didn't wipe the Open Meetings Act out altogether, but he adjusted the in-person quorum requirement for meetings, which no longer applies, and he modified the justification for why someone can attend a meeting remotely. Previously, if you had a medical situation or you were out of town on business, those were proper justifications to attend a meeting remotely. Now, circumstances dictate that the pandemic is largely the reason why these meetings are being held remotely at the urging of both the governor and the attorney general. So the governor's changes to the Open Meetings Act, and the technological realities associated with using remote platforms for zoning hearings make it wise to adopt emergency rules because these hearings really have never been conducted this way before. As a side note, and I know there was a question earlier before we started our chat about Senate Bill 2135. So just a quick aside on that. Over the weekend, the legislature passed SB 2135, which would, if signed by the governor, and it hasn't been signed yet, amend the Open Meetings Act to include some of the relaxed restrictions contained in the governor's executive order. We suspect that the governor will sign this. We don't know for sure, but we think it's coming. And if he does, the need for emergency rules governing remote zoning hearings will become even more apparent because the bill includes new requirements beyond those included in the governor's executive order. But for the purposes of today's talk, we'll focus on the governor's executive order that's currently in force and is the law of the land in Illinois at 11:36 a.m. on May 28th. 2020 anyway. So emergency rules can help in a number of ways. They can help commissioners get comfortable with remote proceedings and how they'll be conducted, and they can communicate to the public how they can participate in the hearing. And this point is critical. No matter how or where a hearing is being conducted, the public first and foremost wants and needs to understand that they will have an opportunity to be heard during the process and to participate in the proceedings. The rapid switch that we've all been thrown into from in-person hearings to remote hearings makes this even more important. Aside from addressing best practices for remote hearings, the emergency rules can also provide a helpful degree of legal protection. The Open Meetings Act and the Illinois Municipal Code authorize municipalities to adopt rules governing meetings and hearings. Courts generally provide a good deal of deference to communities that adopt and enforce reasonable rules. On the other hand, courts are less forgiving when communities try to enforce rules that they either haven't adopted, so these are generally referred to as, oh, it's a policy, we've been doing this for years, or when municipalities try to enforce rules that conflict with those that have been adopted. It's safe to assume that before March, no community had adopted rules allowing for remote zoning hearings or meetings conducted without any board members being physically present. Adopting emergency rules governing remote hearings will allow municipalities, in the event of a legal challenge, to point to properly adopted procedures consistent with their authority under the law. Again, the need for these rules may become even more apparent shortly if the governor signs Senate Bill 2135. Our third guideline is to secure an open and convenient hearing location if the meeting will not be held entirely remote. This guideline recognizes that there are several ways to hold quote-unquote remote hearings. Some communities will conduct completely remote meetings. The village hall will be closed to the public, everyone's sitting at home, and some meeting participants may even be wearing pants. Other communities have taken a different approach and they're holding partially remote hearings. Some of the commissioners and staff may be present, sometimes members of the public are present, and sometimes the applicant are present. Obviously, anyone who is present will have to comply with the social distancing requirements included in state law, and if any municipality has imposed more strict requirements beyond those. So if your community is considering holding a partially remote hearing, it's important to think about how you will accommodate social distancing. Specifically, how are you going to accommodate a room full of people to ensure that they remain 6 feet from each other? Many municipal facilities really aren't big enough to accommodate this type of spacing. So it's important to look at what other facilities may be available, like community centers or school gyms. Schools are closed right now, so that may be a good fit. And also consider whether your facility has staging rooms where members of the public can watch or listen to the proceedings and then be brought into the hearing room when there's sufficient space to accommodate for social distancing. One other consideration is who is going to play quote unquote traffic cop. Don't assume that people attending the meeting will follow or know the social distancing requirements, no matter how often they've been put out there. Communities need to put up signage and have personnel present to remind people of the requirements they need to follow. So in many respects, it's more involved to conduct a partially remote hearing, but there are some benefits, including helping bridge the digital divide. One potential source of liability associated with remote hearings is a due process claim from someone who doesn't know how to use the remote platform or doesn't have access to it. Not everyone has the internet. It's important to keep that in mind, and not everyone can afford the internet either. These outcomes will vary from community to community. But providing in-person participation options can reduce the likelihood that someone claims their due process rights were violated because they couldn't log on to the meeting platform. All right, our fourth guideline is to identify ways to participate. And the prior guideline we just talked about dovetails nicely into this point. Municipalities need to consider how they will make the meeting accessible to as many people as possible. Don't rely on a single remote platform if possible. Not everyone has internet access. This actually came up in a recent lawsuit where the plaintiff claimed that their due process rights were violated because they couldn't access the remote platform. I don't recall if it was Zoom or Teams or one of the others. But the lawsuit claimed that they couldn't access it, and also roughly a third of the city's population didn't have internet access and couldn't get to the meeting. Thankfully, in that case, the city offered other options, including a call-in number, similar to what Andy was talking about, and the court found that those methods were sufficient. But had they only relied on an internet option, the outcome may have been different. So communities need to build multiple redundant ways for people to participate in the hearing. Zoom webinar, GoToMeeting, and Teams are great, but chances are if you're just using those, you're not reaching everyone. Consider a phone line, dedicated phone line. Also consider whether your meetings are being broadcast live or can be broadcast live on public access TV. And consider posting the hearing video on your community's website after the meeting concludes. That can help folks catch up if they weren't able to attend in person. It's a substitute, partial substitute for the other methods we talked about, but it can be helpful. And also important to keep in mind that the Americans with Disabilities Act still applies during a pandemic. If you are contacted by individuals who request an accommodation to attend the hearing, you need to reasonably accommodate them to the extent possible. All right, our fifth guideline, advertise ways to participate. As important as it is to provide multiple ways for people to participate in the hearing, it really won't matter if you don't effectively spread the word. So you need to include instructions on how to participate in every communication the village distributes concerning the hearing, including the meeting agenda, legal notice, so that's what's published in the paper, what gets mailed out to folks within 250 feet or whatever the area designation is in your community. If you post a sign on the property, it's a good idea to include a reference to remote meeting instructions. Even if you can't include all of those instructions on the sign, you can include a link to the village's or city's website where those instructions are available. Push out information using the village's website, whether it's a dedicated landing page like Highland Park or a banner across the top or whatever you can do. The best advice here is to make it as prominent as possible. And use your village social media feeds. No one really read the public notice section of classifieds, the newspaper before the pandemic, and no one's really reading it now. So it's 2020. The best advice is to acknowledge what tools we have to effectively communicate and use them to help engage the public. Okay, and our sixth guideline here, Jane, if you could flip the slide, that would be great. Thank you. Publicize your hearing materials as soon as possible. So we've discussed why it's important to advertise how people can participate in the meeting. It's equally important to make the hearing materials available early. So that includes your zoning application, any plans, technical reports, staff memo, comments submitted by the public. Anything that would typically be included in the hearing packet should be posted on the village's website for public consumption before the meeting. And before the meeting is more than just the 48 hours notice that the Open Meetings Act requires. You should put it up as soon as possible. If you can get it up a week in advance of the meeting, that's great. If you can do it sooner, even better. So materials that are posted on the website should be clearly labeled and ideally paginated. This will make the discussions during the hearing much easier. Whoever's speaking can refer to page 24 of the application packet, which people can then turn to and they'll know exactly what they're talking about. Do this early to allow people an opportunity to review the materials. It's important to keep in mind that many folks are used to picking up an agenda and a meeting packet outside the hearing room. We can't really do that for the most part anymore. All right, our 7th guideline, identify speakers before the hearing to the extent possible. Remote platforms aren't as seamless as in-person hearings, and things are strange when someone refers to a zoning hearing as seamless, but it's helpful here to try to limit as many surprises as you can. And one avoidable surprise is determining who wants to speak. This is easy, generally speaking, on the applicant side. You can ask them for a list of names and titles of people that are going to be presenting during the meeting or who they think will present during the meeting. A little trickier for the public, but communities should still try. Identifying public speakers ahead of time will allow staff time to provide instructions on how to use the remote meeting platform. Now, this is important to know, this is not an opportunity to screen comments or content. And it's also not an opportunity for municipalities to prohibit those who fail to register before the meeting to have a chance to speak at the hearing. You need to allow people an opportunity to participate. This is just like an in-person hearing. If someone wants to talk, you need to let them talk. But and you should not shut people out just because they didn't follow a procedural requirement like submitting a form. But it's helpful to identify speakers in advance because it gives staff an opportunity to engage with those speakers and help them navigate the technical issues associated with the remote meeting platform. And it will also give staff a heads up on what types of input or objections they can reasonably expect to hear at the remote hearing. So it serves a couple of purposes there. Our 8th guideline, and Andy touched on this earlier, is designate a hearing administrator. Communities that are conducting these hearings should not have an elected or an appointed official managing the technology. Have someone from staff manage this who's familiar with it and has practiced with it and knows the ins and outs. Your appointed officials have enough on their plate trying to evaluate substantive criteria during a public hearing, and they should not also be trying to figure out how to unmute people and keep the hearing moving forward. 2 more guidelines to go. Number 9, establish a hearing outline. It's important to keep in mind that remote hearings are new to everyone. Staff, the public, commissioners, and applicants, nobody has gone through this before. In these new and uncertain times, one of the most important things a community can do is to provide a certainty of process. A clearly defined process doesn't guarantee victory for the objectors or the applicants, but it helps everyone understand that what the rules are and how they will be applied during the hearing. The hearing outline goes a long way toward providing that sense of security. The outline should include an opening statement by the chairperson and a somewhat detailed explanation of how the meeting will progress. Again, this is reminding folks of when they're going to have an opportunity to speak and how they're going to have an opportunity to participate. Much of this can be addressed in any emergency rules that a community adopts, but the goal, as is almost always the case, is to communicate effectively with all participants during the meeting. And our final guideline, this is more common sense than anything. Zoning hearings, whether they're conducted remotely or in person, entail greater due process rights than other public meetings. Communities need to keep this in mind when conducting remote hearings. Communities should give greater consideration to conducting hearings over multiple dates to provide the public a fair and reasonable opportunity to participate. Hearings should not be concluded due to technical issues or other matters related to the remote hearing platforms. Taking an inclusive, flexible approach here will allow for a much more meaningful hearing process and reduce the likelihood of potential litigation, which is why I was invited to sit on this panel in the first place. So with that, I will send it back to Jake.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for this very interesting information and touching on all these points. As you might have guessed, questions have been pouring in. Some are more general, some are more specific. But before we get into those, we just have a quick poll question for you that I was going to launch. So speaking of technical issues, I'm doing this for the first time, so let's give it a shot. Question is, have you held a virtual public meeting? Yes, no, or not applicable. And while we're collecting that information, maybe just start with some of the more technical questions. Let's see here. One question was about GoToMeeting, if we can also provide live web shots from that similar to Zoom, and the answer to that is yes. CMAP chose not to enable that function today. And then a question for Andy on the phone capabilities. Andy, if several phone attendees hit *9 at the same time, does the situation still work? Does it sort itself out?
Yeah, good question. It's Zoom thought of that because each attendee has their own hand. So if several phone callers all hit *9, then there's a little blue hand icon that goes up by their name in the attendee list. And I use a setting in Zoom to mask phone numbers because you don't, in case it goes public. So the routine has been to say, okay, caller with the last 4 digits 4171, I'm going to unmute you now. Please address the commission. And then you can lower their hand as host. So that's it. Everybody's got their own hand. So multiple people at once is no problem.
Great, thank you for that. And then another question, sounds like more of a process type question. I think I'm gonna throw this to Greg. For planning commission cases that affect property owners, the affected property owners receive a notice for the public hearing and have a legal right to offer comments. This is a question about a subordinate commission reviewing a planning commission application at an open meeting. Does the subordinate commission allow the public to provide testimony about the planning commission application at the open meeting?
Okay, so it sounds like this is a public meeting before the public hearing, if I'm understanding it correctly. And yeah, the answer is it's fine to accept input outside of the public hearing, although the Planning Commission's recommendation needs to be based on the record built at the public hearing. So if there's input that's provided at a public meeting that's not subsequently provided at a public hearing, and that provides a basis for the decision, then you're opening yourself up to a potential challenge there. The best practice there is to direct all testimony to the public hearing format, because that's when everyone's sworn in, that's when it's all on the record, and that's the legally established proper basis to recommend approval or denial of an application.
Great. Thank you, Greg. The next one, I think this is more of a Rory question, but feel free, any of you, to weigh in on this one. The asker is interested in virtual forums. So, for example, virtual forums in underserved communities. The example that they provide is perhaps transportation stakeholders for the CTA Red Line Extension project. We don't have any folks from CTA on this panel, but Rory, I was wondering if you could maybe take that question a little more broadly.
Is the question what tool or how to approach engagement for?
Yeah, I think more of the approach.
Okay. Obviously, that's a big concern that we're all trying to sort through, is equity in using digital platforms, especially if you have a population which may not have access to the internet or readily access to the internet. There are like some creative solutions to provide opportunities for public input outside the virtual environment that I think we need to be cognizant of as we move forward. I think we're planning for a world that probably needs to have both virtual and in-person opportunities, whether that's an in-person meeting or, like I said, creating kind of meeting in a box tools to drop off to different community centers. We found that to be super effective even before COVID-19. So I would expect that to continue and probably be amplified. I think depending on your communication or depending on your population, obviously there are different considerations to factor, whether it's accessibility concerns, translation needs. Some of these virtual tools are capable of providing those services, some are not. So being cognizant of who your constituency is and the goals that you're trying to achieve, and making sure you're determining the appropriate tool. I will say that the matrix does provide a summary specifically with surveys and feedback tools on options for translation needs and Section 508 compliance. So that might be useful for a project like CTA Redline. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but some ideas to consider. I don't know, Greg or Andy, if you have other things to contribute.
No, I think Rory hit the nail on the head. I think remote platforms are here to stay. Even if it's not a legal requirement, I think it's going to become a best practice. There are going to be segments of the population who are going to necessarily, because of the virus, be home a lot more for the foreseeable future. So at least for the next year or so, and then probably moving forward, because we're going to get a great forced trial run on how these remote platforms work. But I can see this becoming very much a part of everything that the planning community does on a regular basis.
I agree in that. My one thought of that, we've had some talks in the office about, well, virtually, about how it might look at some sort of hybrid where, you know, if you're going to have a virtual or a real public hearing, are you going to be required, you know, let's say in 6-8 months a year, are you going to be required to have a virtual element as well, virtual participation, and how that would play out?
All right, well, thank you all for those answers. There was another question for CMAP that I can handle. A question about whether CMAP was going to be providing online or virtual tech specialists to help community groups organize virtual forums. And the answer to the honest answer to that question is we don't know. We are still trying to figure out what our role is in the region during the crisis. At this point, we've been trying to get really as much information out to the world as possible through, you know, webinars like this, but also through our website and through our weekly posts. In terms of, you know, working with specific community groups and specific municipalities or counties, we haven't really gotten to that yet. We're trying to figure out our work plan for the coming year. So hopefully have to have a better answer for you on that in the weeks and months to come. Just have time for one or two more questions. Let's see. This is kind of a specific question, but it might have a more general answer. I think this sounds like a Greg Jones question. How would you see this working for a liquor hearing or other types of government hearings for other types of bodies?
That's a great question, and it's not real clear at this point. There's a significant body of law surrounding zoning hearings, which makes this in some cases easier because we've got some benchmarks to go by, and in some cases more difficult because you have to comply with more protocols. In the liquor context, there's also some case law there, and generally speaking, it's, you know, fewer due process rights. You're typically just dealing with the liquor license holder who's having his license either suspended or revoked or have some sort of adverse action taken against them. So it's a more defined universe of people. It's the liquor commissioner, the local prosecutor, and typically the license holder who are involved in that hearing. So it's a little easier in that respect. But you're going to have to proceed carefully here because there are still due process guarantees that apply in that context as well.
Great, thank you, Greg. We're just about coming up on noon here, so it's probably time to wrap up. We just wanted to thank you all so much for being with us here today. Thank you very much to Rory, Andy, and Greg for all of their information as well. Wanted to give a special shout out to my colleagues at CMAP for all the work that they did to make this webinar a reality. We also encourage you to follow us on social media, subscribe to the CMAP weekly newsletter, and to please keep an eye out for exciting CMAP talks like this in the near future. So we've got all of our information up there on the screen. And like I said, this webinar will be available in the near future for repeat viewings if you're interested, or to send to friends and colleagues. Thank you all again, everybody. Have a great day.